There you
Well, let
go.
me just tell a little bit more about my background.
Yeah,
Um,
please.
yeah, I was a student at Broadview Academy in 1970, 78. My previous year, I'd been in high school ROTC. I liked all that marching stuff from Pathfinders.
Hmm.
But at Broadview, started thinking about ministry. Dick Havenecht was the pastor at the time. Some of you know him. Uh,
I
and
do
then we
know
had a
him.
speaker. Then we had a speaker one day for chapel, a guy named Dick Stenbakken. The draft had ended a couple of years before, and uh, he and others were out talking about what we should be doing related to that. And he mentioned chaplains, and I said, "So what does it take to be an army chaplain?" And he said, "First you have to be a pastor, then we have to pick you. Next question." And everybody laughed, and I told him that story when I reconnected with him in 2010 at the GC in Atlanta, and he said, "Yep, sounds like what I would say." Um, so I ended up, I graduated from AUC, started graduate study with Paul Landa at what was then the La Sierra campus of Loma Linda University, helped him with editing Adventist Heritage. So there's my church history pedigree starts coming from there. Transferred to a Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary when Niels Erik Andreasen told me he couldn't fund my teaching assistantship for another year. Finished with my MA in church history, my MDiv, got into the Army chaplaincy as a chaplain candidate while in seminary in the Army Reserve. That was 40 years ago, 1986. And that fall, I did a unit of clinical pastoral education at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. They made me chaplain for neurosurgery and neurology. So that started my chaplaincy work. I went on, just summarizing quickly, I had some congregational ministry, did campus ministry, had 10 years military, got out when my kids were small and having health issues, re-upped in '09, did 10 more, got my combat patch for a trip to Kuwait in 2013. And while I was deployed, Gary Council said, you've had deployment experience, you're a supervisory chaplain, you've had other kinds of chaplaincy. He says, how would you like to come to NAD? And so from 2014 until 2023, I had 9 years as the assistant director for Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries for the North American Division. I covered the territories of the Mid America Union and the Southwestern Union from my home here in Houston, Texas. And then I left that position. Paul Anderson was the director, and he said, "You don't want to die in this job. Go do some more CPE so you can get a job at the VA." And I did that. And I've been here chaplain at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center since November 2023. And I'm
Hmm.
primarily chaplain for the emergency room. I do suicide prevention training in the community. I'm on our state executive committee for suicide prevention. Uh, and I play chaplain for our police department at the VA. So that's my background and how this topic ends up being one that I'm interested in. And as somebody who works for the VA, I am required to make this little disclaimer that, of course, what I'm saying does not represent the Department of Veterans Affairs. But I want to give some appreciation for some friends of mine for their influence on the presentation as I give it today. Uh, Kevin Burton has done so much diving into the Millerite views on nonviolence and nonresistance, as well as the World War I era. Sabrina Riley's been doing a lot of stuff with both World War I, and she wrote the article about Carlyle B. Haynes in the online Adventist Encyclopedia, done a lot of stuff about the Medical Cadet Corps. And Michael Campbell's done a little bit of everything. He used to, when he was teaching at Southwestern, he'd have me come up and give a class on this topic every semester. So I'm grateful to those folks. I'm standing on their shoulders. But why talk about this now? Well, we've already covered some of the things in the world today that make this issue of peace and nonviolence something that is timely. But also, I think of The Lion King. Remember who you are. Because I think a lot of people are forgetting. I think of this scene from Casablanca where the police chief says, I'm shocked to find that there's gambling going on in here. And I've had Adventist pastors say, I'm shocked to learn that Adventists ever had a position on that was anti-military or anti-war. That was a pastor in a large church in a certain conference who graduated from an Adventist college, had his MDiv from the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University, and he said he knew nothing about Adventists ever having a heritage of nonviolence. And so I was shocked that he had that he could say that with that education. Of course, then there's people like this Adventist. He was asked when he was running for president about his views on war. And he tried to make a comparison to being a surgeon. You don't want to take out little bits of cancer. You want to go get the whole thing. So he made that analogy to war and said, you have to be able to look at the big picture and understand that it's actually merciful if you go ahead and finish the job rather than death by 1,000 pricks. The interviewer said, so you're okay with the deaths of thousands of innocent children and civilians? It's like, you got it. You got it. And of course, we've seen the morph of Ben Carson from respected neurosurgeon to an echoer of Donald Trump. As a chaplain, now with 40 years of ministry to both veterans and service members, I think of William Tecumseh Sherman's famous statement, I'm tired and sick of war. Its glory is all moonshine. It is only those who've never fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood, for vengeance, for desolation. War is hell. And we went through 20 years of war so that young men who fought after 9/11, their children were deploying to Afghanistan and Iraq and fighting over the same territory as their parents had 20 years before. And it was, I think a lot of civilians grew tired of hearing about it or just tuned it out and weren't really keeping up with it. I was even at a Veterans of Foreign War state conference when the deputy commander of the Veterans of Foreign War said, well, now that we're done with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I stood up and I said, excuse me, I'm a chaplain. Some of my soldiers are currently in battle in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. So how could somebody who represents a national veterans organization say it's all done with? So that can get my dander up. I started, as I said, at Walter Reed, and I had soldiers say, well, we can't tell you this. We're not supposed to talk about it, but you're a chaplain, so we can tell you that we are in Central America. This is in the mid-'80s. We're not just advisors. We're fighting. We're being killed. We're seeing friends die. And it was Bill Clinton who was the first president to acknowledge the combat role of U.S. troops in those illegal wars and to dedicate a monument at Arlington to honor those who died in it. But that's the world that I've lived in, hearing the stories, and especially the disillusionment of the veterans of the global war on terror who, like Vietnam War veterans, say, we were lied to. We got into this on false pretenses, and why did our friends die? And so suicide has been a big thing I've dealt with. 6 suicides in my brigade in 1 week, 3 in 1 battalion. 6 months later, the battalion commander killed himself. And also the whole field of moral injury, which is looking at the guilt and shame that that many veterans feel for their part and even being associated with things that have been done. So that's why it's a personal issue to me. But from a positive stance, what is the Great Commission that we have at church? It is to go and teach all nations, teach them the teachings of Jesus, inviting them to become disciples of him, that his teachings on the Sermon on the Mount have real, vital meaning and purpose for his disciples. So for Adventists, we start, of course, with William Miller. And here's where Kevin Burton has really uncovered a lot of things, and he still hasn't published the bulk of his research, but I'm really excited about it. But what I've got here comes from him. Of course, we think just of William Miller in the 2300 days and this little farmer who's just obsessed with numerology and hidden meanings in the Bible. But he was more than that. William Lloyd Garrison, the great liberator, the anti-slavery advocate, said in 1843 that while he didn't go along with Miller's numerology, he said, the cause of temperance, of anti-slavery, of moral reform, of non-resistance finds in him an outspoken friend. That Miller and many of his colleagues, it was not just the Second Coming. They were active in all of these reform movements of the day. They didn't see them as contrary to their teaching of the soon coming of Jesus. They would point to Matthew 24 and 25, saying, yes, we're looking forward to this coming of Jesus, and we're preaching the signs of his return, but he's given us clear work to do now for the poor, for the hungry, for the victims of injustice. So here's just one quote from Miller in the Advent Herald in 1844. They must not countenance nor support war, for that cometh from lust. James 4. They must not have respect to the rich and despise the poor, for that is judging unrighteously. And this is a guy who had been a captain in the War of 1812. He had seen soldiers in his artillery battery blown up in front of him. And he came out with a very anti-war perspective that I think we need to do more in discovering things that haven't been published yet about his writings on the topic. But you see there's also that social justice line, that social justice and peace, starting with Miller, go together. Here's Joseph Bates. We know Joseph Bates as a prominent anti-slavery activist. He chaired one of the great anti-slavery meetings in Boston. And he said, when Jesus begins to promulgate his gospel, the stoning system is all broken up. See his admirable Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. Here we see that all the followers of Jesus are to be peacemen or non-resistance, an entire change in administering the law. So this phrase, non-resistance, either as a thing or as people, is the key phrase at this time in history. 19th century, we had all these reform movements going on in all these different areas that the Adventist pioneers were also involved in. And one of those movements was the non-resistance movement, which was saying we need to apply the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount to life. And Garrison himself formed the New England Non-Resistance Society in September of 1838. And among its first officers were William Lloyd Garrison, Bronson Alcott, the mother of Louisa May Alcott and other little women, Aidan Ballou, and Joshua V. Haynes. You may recognize that particular name. And he said, our country is the world, our countrymen are all mankind. This is kind of their initial proposal of what their principles were. We love the land of our nativity only as we love all other lands. The interests, rights, liberties of American citizens are no more clear to us than are those of the whole human race. Hence, we can allow no appeal to patriotism to revenge any national insult or injury. The Prince of Peace, under whose stainless banner we rally, came not to destroy, but to save even the worst of enemies. We register our testimony, not only against all wars, whether offensive or defensive, but all preparations for war, against every naval ship, every arsenal, every fortification, against the militia system and a standing army, against all military chieftains and soldiers, against all monuments commemorative of victory over a fallen foe, all trophies won in battle, all celebrations in honor of military or naval exploits, against all appropriations for the defense of a nation by force force and arms on the part of any legislative body against every edict of government requiring of its subjects military service. Hence, we deem it unlawful to bear arms or to hold a military office. We know not where to look for Christianity, if not to its founder. In taking the record of his life and death, of his teaching and example, we can discover nothing which even remotely, under any conceivable circumstances, justifies the use of the sword or rifle on the part of his followers. On the contrary, we find nothing but self-sacrifice, willing martyrdom if it need be, peace and goodwill, and the prohibition of all retaliatory feelings enjoined upon all who would be his disciples. So that's the fertile ground in which Miller, Haynes, Bates, and others are coming from. Now, after 1844, the push was on just ministering to the little flock, gathering people together in the wake of the disappointment. So it's not until 1862 that the church really has which hasn't even been founded yet officially as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but it's 1862 when the issue really comes to a forefront for believers and Americans with the question of, will there be a draft in the United States during the Civil War? And James White got this going by this article he wrote called The Nation in August of 1862. The position which our people have taken relative to the perpetuity and sacredness of the law of God contained in the Ten Commandments is not in harmony with all the requirements of war. The fourth precept of that law says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The sixth says, thou shalt not kill. But in the case of drafting, the government assumes the responsibility of the violation of the law of God. Parenthetically, I don't think that's the Bible. That's more Shakespeare, Henry V. And it would be madness to resist. He who would resist until in the administration of military law he was shot down goes too far, we think, in taking the responsibility of suicide. Those who are loyal to the government of heaven, true to the Constitution and laws of the ruler of the universe, are the last men to sneak off to Canada or to Europe or to stand trembling in their shoes for fear of a military draft. And note, that's 1862, not 1962, that they're running off to Canada. And 2 weeks later, James is having to address the correspondence that provoked. He said, several brethren referred to our remarks under this caption, The Nation, 2 weeks since, in rather a feverish style. We invite them to read the article again and be sure they understand our position before opposing it. Hold, brethren. This is no time for Christian gentlemen to give way to feelings of prejudice and virtually charge us with teaching Sabbath breaking and murder. You'd better all go to God with this matter and secure to yourselves a humble, teachable spirit. Then if any of you are drafted and choose to have a clinch with Uncle Sam rather than to obey, you can try it. We shall not contend with you, lest some of you non-resistants get up a little war before you are called upon to fight for your country. Any well-written articles calculated to shed light upon our duty as a people in reference to the present war will receive prompt attention. And sure enough, if you read the issues in the months following that, you will see all manner of opinion. Some were from that non-resistant camp, not everybody. Some came in ready to fight for the Union, others not so sure. But 1863, March 3rd, the first draft law is enacted, pay $300 and a substitute. And, there were about 3,000 Adventists at that time, and it was no big deal for them to take up a collection at the Battle Creek Church or other places to provide for the substitute. But too many people were taking advantage of that loophole. So the federal government said, well, we're going to close it. Now, you see at this time is also May 21st, 1863 is when the General Conference is organized. And part of this pressure from the war was part of the reason. Because as the law on conscription was modified, you could only get an exemption if you were a member of a church that has been historically known to be opposed to bearing arms. And in 1865, the war is over at this point, but the church produced two publications to outline what the church's view was, as well as the history, to show, hey, no, we're not a new church is just springing out of nowhere. We've got a history on this subject. So you have this one, and let me get that out of the way. On the views of Seventh-day Adventists relative to bearing arms as brought before the governors of several states and the Provost Marshal General with a portion of the enrollment law, and compilations of extracts from the publications of Seventh-day Adventists setting forth their views on the sinfulness of war referred to in the annexed affidavits. And so these are the kinds of statements they brought to bear to show we're not new and we've been consistent. So here's Joseph Bates in his pamphlet, Opening Heavens, Seventh-day Sabbath and Waymarks, 1846. And it's looking at the Mexican War, which most abolitionists opposed and saw just as a land grab to steal land for slavery. He said, our neighbors, the Mexicans, undertook some years ago to obey God by breaking the yoke of their slaves. This was too much for the most enlightened nation under the sun to bear. So a revolt ensued, and finally we took a part of their territory from them. From hence has come this havoc and murder. And one portion of the professed church in this boasted land of Bibles and converts have held a convention, and in their zeal for God, as they would have it, have chosen the chief murderer with some of his principal associates and made them honorary members of the Methodist Missionary Society during their lives. I was kind of curious if I could find out who exactly were the ones that the Methodist Church so honored. I couldn't find that. But I did find this article about the Methodists and the Mexican War. The church had split between North and South in 1844 over the issue of slavery, but both branches agreed on this. Methodists believed that the war was necessary to overthrow the entrenched Catholic Church in Mexico and open the way for the true Christianization of the oppressed Mexican people. Both the Northern and Southern Methodist Episcopal churches argued that the adoption of Protestant Christianity by Mexico would lead not only to the salvation of individuals, but also to the political freedom and economic prosperity associated with republicanism. So if you think Adventists in the period were anti-Catholic, I think Adventists stand second place to the Methodists at that time. Then getting back to quotes from these Adventist publications on what was being printed. So here was a piece that was in the Review and Herald, but it quotes a Methodist publication that took the other position, the Wesleyan. In 1853, professing Christians as well as infidels have tried to prove that the Bible sanctions slavery and war and polygamy. The Bible nowhere lends its high and solemn sanction to any form of moral evil. James White, 1853, the church is unlawfully wedded to the world. This may be seen in the various departments of civil government. Even in the War Department, the professed minister of Jesus Christ is seen mocking the God of peace with his prayers for success in battle. And of course, now our Department of Defense is styled by some as the Department of War, and they had a Christmas service in December, this past December, and Franklin Graham was the speaker, and he denounced those who think that God is just a God of love and peace, but God is also a God of hate and war and genocide. So these things from the 1850s are very much relevant for today's world. Advent Review, 1856, has the gospel of Jesus granted you the right to use the sword, to arm you with carnal weapons, to take the sword to provide for your own household, to take the oppressed out of the power of the oppressor by breaking the sixth commandment of God, thou shalt not kill? Jesus says, love your enemies. It's interesting, though, that there's that bit about taking the oppressed out of the power of the oppressor, because the Adventists had quite a different opinion when it came to John Brown's attempted insurrection. You have some positive things said about him by Ellen White, So she's got some ambiguity on the subject. We'll see more about that later. J.H. Wagner, The Nature and Tendency of Modern Spiritualism. He's talking about other Christians. They boast of their connection with politics as an evidence that they're going to evangelize the nation. Oh, again, sounds very contemporary. But they are not elevating the politics of the nation to a level with Christianity. They are lowering down Christianity to the level of the most degenerate national policy. Do we not send our reverend chaplains with our invading armies to invoke the blessing of God upon our battles? Do not our churches rejoice in our victories and thank God that our enemies have been put to the flight at the point of the bayonet or by the edge of the sword? Do we not present the beautiful and sublime spectacle before the heathen world and before angels and God of one Christian and hostile and deadly array against another? They had such a wonderful way of putting their sarcasm into print. How then is the converting the world to such Christianity to put an end to war? M.E. Cornell, 1861. The sentiment of a popular minister that Sharp's rifles are the best peacemakers shows how they would introduce their millennium. So now, when we read in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, we must understand it. Blessed be Sharp's rifles. Truly, they have put darkness for light and turned things upside down. But let us not sleep, as do others. So after that debate, though, the General Conference leadership came to consensus. And they started writing to governors of the states. August 1864, to the Michigan governor, the denomination of Christians calling themselves Seventh-day Adventists, taking the Bible as their rule of faith and practice, are unanimous in their views that its teachings are contrary to the spirit and practice of war. Hence, they have ever been conscientiously opposed to bearing arms. If there is any portion of the Bible which we as a people can point to more than another as our creed, it is the law of 10 commandments, which we regard as the supreme law, and each precept of which we take in its most obvious and literal import. The fourth of these commandments requires cessation from labor on the seventh day of the week. The sixth prohibits the taking of life, neither which, in our view, could be observed while doing military duty. So there's a little bit of disingenuousness there, because 2 years before they were arguing about what the position of the church should be. But now they've come together and they say, we are now agreed on this, and always have been. In a letter to the Illinois governor in 1864, there is in this part of our state a number of church organizations of the Seventh-day Adventists who are as truly non-combatants as the Society of Friends and who are conscientiously opposed to bearing arms. So we're like the Quakers, they said. Think of us like the Quakers. Treat us like the Quakers. And I haven't pursued it all the way, but I'm pretty sure that it was from the Quakers and the abolitionist movement that Garrison got his view of nonviolence, that they had that influence upon these others. Now, George Amidon was the manager of the review, and he wrote out, which is what is probably the only systematic presentation and Bible study on the topic. So it becomes not only an article in the review, but it becomes the centerpiece of those pamphlets. Why Seventh-day Adventists cannot engage in war. First, couldn't keep the Sabbath. As military men tell us, it's the hardest kind of work. The seventh day of all days would be the least regarded in the camp and field. So you're not going to be able to keep the Sabbath. Number two, 10 commandments. Thou shalt not kill. To kill is to take life. The soldier by profession is a practical violator of this precept. 3, God hath called us to peace, and the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. The gospel permits us to use no weapons but the sword of the Spirit. Our kingdom is not of this world, said Christ to Pilate. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. This is most indisputable evidence that Christians have nothing to do with the carnal instruments of war. We are commanded to love even our enemies. But I say unto you, says the Savior, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you. And pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Do we fulfill this command when we blow out their brains with revolvers or sever their bodies with sabers? If any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. Our work is the same as our masters, who once said, the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. If God's Spirit sends us to save men, does not some other spirit send us to destroy them? Let us know what manner of spirit we are of. The New Testament command is resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. That is, we had better turn the other cheek than to smite them back again. Could this scripture be obeyed on the battlefield? Christ said to Peter as he struck the high priest's servant, put up again thy sword. If the Savior commanded the apostle to put up the sword, certainly his followers have no right to take it. Then let those who are of the world fight, but as for us, let us pray. And that's very similar to what Tertullian said in the early church, that Christ, in taking the sword away from Peter, has disarmed all Christians. 1865 GC session now comes up with an official platform on the subject. Our views of war resolved that we acknowledge the pamphlet entitled Extracts from the Publications of SD Adventists, setting forth their views on the sinfulness of war as a truthful representation of the views held by us from the beginning of our existence as a people relative to bearing arms. Our duty to the government resolved that we recognize civil government as ordained of God, that order, justice, and quiet may be maintained in the land, and that the people of God may lead quiet and peaceable lives in all godliness and honesty. In accordance with this fact, we acknowledge the justice of rendering tribute, custom, honor, and reverence to the civil power, as enjoined in the New Testament. While we thus cheerfully render to Caesar the things which the scriptures show to be his, we are compelled to decline all participation in acts of war and bloodshed as being inconsistent with the duties enjoined upon us by our divine master toward our enemies and toward all mankind. Now, they don't use this language, but here they're getting at a theology that in the Anabaptist tradition talks about the two kingdoms, that, you know, the state has certain prerogatives, including protecting its citizens, but we're part of the kingdom of God. And even if we acknowledge the right of the world to take care of things that way, we as disciples of Jesus have obligations to the kingdom of God. Now, a lot of people today will casually throw out the term pacifist in referring to early Adventists. But, you know, that term never existed before 1901. A French philosopher, Émile Arnaud, he was president of the International League of Peace and Liberty. And at the Universal Peace Congress number 10 in Glasgow, 1901, they agreed on this code of peace that first coined the term pacifism and gave it a definition, meant to suggest a coherent body of thought and developed set of political beliefs and policies preventing war and assuring peace. So as those who coined the term pacifism meant it, it wasn't just individual morality or living in the kingdom of God. It was a political platform for how nations should govern themselves and their relationships with others. And throughout this, you know, Adventists are not telling the government what to do, though certainly Garrison was early on, but they're saying this is our duty as individual Christians. Let us be true to our own convictions. So I'd say, no, they were not pacifists when you understand pacifism in that strict definition. Today, we've broadened it, and a pacifist ends up being anybody who's opposed to violence or war. Historians quibble. And now Ellen White. You know, she's kind of interesting in here because, you know, she says some things that seem counter to the GC, and the GC won over her. For instance, here's this big section in Testimonies, Volume 1. starting around 350 or so, on the rebellion. And here she's talking in Iowa, and she doesn't say who they are, but Benjamin Snook and William Brinkerhoff, in a response to it, said, yeah, it's us she's talking about. In Iowa, they, Snook and Brinkerhoff, the so-called Marian Party, if you remember that name, they carried things to quite a length and ran into fanaticism. They mistook zeal and fanaticism for conscientiousness. Instead of being guided by reason and sound judgment, they allowed their feelings to take the lead. They were ready to become martyrs for their faith. Did all this feeling lead them to God, to greater humility before him? Did it lead them to trust in his power to deliver them from the trying position into which they might be brought? Oh, no. Instead of making their petitions to the God of heaven and relying solely upon his power, they petitioned the legislature. Why? For exemption from the draft. And they were refused. They showed their weakness and exposed their lack of faith. All this only served to bring that peculiar class, Sabbath keepers, into special notice and expose them to be crowded into difficult places by those who have no sympathy for them. So now Snook and Brinkerhoff in 1866, they wrote their book, The Visions of E.G. White, Not of God, and they pointed out that she's condemning them for what the General Conference itself did a year later. So if we're fanatics, what about them? How can you approve that and condemn us? And they pointed out that she gave very contradictory and confusing and foggy advice about the war, but she gave very detailed guidance on the length of dresses and how many inches from the floor and the knee it should be. She said, which is a little more important, they said. She goes on, I saw that those who have been forward to talk so decidedly about refusing to obey a draft do not understand what they're talking about. Should they really be drafted and refusing to obey, be threatened with imprisonment, torture, or death? They would shrink and then find that they had not prepared themselves for such an emergency. They would not endure the trial of their faith. What they thought to be faith was only fanatical presumption. And here she seems to have no awareness, no clue of the history of Christians who were nonviolent and did suffer for their faith, or the Mennonites, the Amish, the Quakers, and others who suffered during the American Revolution and during the Civil War because of their refusal. And they took that cross upon themselves cheerfully, feeling that that's what Christ called them to. So her knowledge was very narrow and very limited. Those who feel that in the fear of God they cannot conscientiously engage in this war will be very quiet, and when interrogated will simply state what they are obligated to say in order to answer the inquirer, and then let it be understood that they have no sympathy with the rebellion. So don't teach peace, don't preach it, don't say anything, just be quiet unless somebody says, but say, I'm a loyal American, I'm against the rebellion. She goes on, I was shown that God's people, who are his peculiar treasure, cannot engage in this perplexing war, for it is opposed to every principle of their faith. In the army, they cannot obey the truth and at the same time obey the requirements of their officers. There would be a continual violation of conscience. Well, you see what I say, some confusion that stands in a little contrast to some of the things that she said earlier. Now, she's referring there in context to people joining up, since the draft has not yet been promulgated in January of 1863. That's the way around that. But if you look at Ellen White in total, she really does not contribute much of anything to the conversation or to the church's voted position. Look at Great Controversy. She has great praise for all the Reformation leaders, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. Oh, she especially loves Zwingli. And she never says anything about their using violence against the peasants, against Jews, against the Anabaptists. Not a word. She says nothing about the Anabaptists at all, except she has a couple of paragraphs on Menno Simons and commends him for going against and putting down the fanaticism that was at Munster, where one extreme wing of who consider themselves Anabaptists, tried to create their own little kingdom of God and died by the sword and did some very crazy things, but she doesn't mention them by name. But she commends Menno for bringing unity. But again, she never says anything about his teachings on nonviolence. She never says anything about the Quakers, except for a quote of John Wesley referring to attacks on the Methodists, that they are Quakerism, fanaticism, and popery. And one would have thought, in a book where the theme is the conflict between God's kingdom and Satan's, and the attempt of people to unite belief with earthly power to use violence against others, that the Anabaptists and the Quakers would be front and center of people who had recovered the teachings of Jesus on those principles. But she seems to be ignorant completely. Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings would be a great point to talk about nonviolence and the call of Christianity, but nothing there. Silence. She went to Switzerland, and in Zurich, she visited the Grossmünster, the big church that was where Zwingli preached, and right at the foot of the water is the Wasserkirche, which in her day was a library rather than a church. And she talked about Zwingli's preaching, about seeing his Bible open, seeing his, quote, his veritable handwriting. And the statue that's in back of the Wasserkirche, if you've been to Zurich, and there's Zwingli in his robes, the Bible, and with his sword. And he ended up dying on the battlefield. She refers to him as a chaplain, but a recent biography of Zwingli shows he was much more than that. He was really the military strategist. He wasn't just going in there to pray, he was wielding the sword. And Luther said afterwards, well, those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. There goes Zwingli. But again, she's going around these steps. And today there's on the Limmat River, there's a plaque commemorating the Anabaptists who were drowned at Zwingli's urging. And the Reformed Church of Zurich has apologized. This past year was the 500th anniversary of the Anabaptist movement. And the Reformed Church has taken many opportunities to apologize and to embrace the teachings of the Anabaptists on violence as true to the gospel. But Ellen White knew nothing about it. She doesn't go to any sites. Nobody tells her anything about it. She doesn't ask any questions about that part of Zwingli's bloody history. Now, you see, in the beginning, he's very evangelical, but once he starts taking on the mantle of the protection of the state, he becomes an apologist for the state. And he stops quoting Jesus as much and talks a lot more about Moses and the laws of Israel and his desire to turn Zurich into a kind of theocracy. Of course, Calvin picks that up in Geneva, and that whole Reformed attitude spills over to the Puritans in England, in New England, and other places. But Ellen White is silent. And that, again, could have been built up the argument of the great controversy that church and state need to stay separate, because whenever the state takes on the mantle of Christ, it starts killing its enemies. But she's silent. And when she noted in Basel that all the employees of the church had to do their military service, she had no question about that draft, and she even oohed and awed over their medals. 20th century brought new challenges, especially World War I. And there was a lot of government pressure then, more than we really realize today, for support of that war. Wilson took away habeas corpus more so than any president since Lincoln, revoked civil liberties, and just put 100% government pressure on the society to get everything involved in the war effort. The phrase becomes popular then, and it's continued since in some circles, that they wanted a 100% Americanism, not Irish Americans, not Italian Americans, not Christians who are going to be partly loyal and partly supportive. We need 100% Americanism and 100% support for the war. Suspicion of Germans and those who spoke German. Well, we'll get to the Adventist response a bit. Censorship of any criticism, even one senator went to prison because of his criticism of the president. Propaganda. Now, here's a little booklet for instruction for Minutemen. And these men were trained before any public event. You go to the movie theater, the 4-minute man's going to get up and give a speech. You go to your Masonic lodge, he's going to get up and give a speech. These people are fanning around the countryside, local volunteers and everything. They're standing up to give their 4-minute speech about why everybody needs to be supporting the war. The unions came under fire. Anti-communism starts then as a result of the Russian Revolution. You're expected to make patriotic demonstrations of your loyalty. Oh, they're optional, of course, but if you don't put your flag in your church, if you don't have a war bond campaign, if you as a church are not paying to buy war bonds, then you're suspicious, and pastors were beaten, churches were terrorized, all to get on board with this. Now here's some of the propaganda posters. Dehumanizing the enemy, making everybody part of the war effort, and bringing the Christian flag alongside the U.S. flag as a banner of support for the war. I just finished this book by John Barry on the great influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. And a lot of the book is about the development of modern scientific medicine, starting with Johns Hopkins in the 1890s. That's the time that Ellen White starts telling people at Battle Creek, hey, go to Ann Arbor, to the University of Michigan Medical School for your medical degrees. Get on board with this. But he also talks about this whole campaign of Wilson to just, today we'd say he was almost fascist in his rule of American society and his control over every aspect of American life. I don't think enough has been done on Wilson for that. So the church starts out reaffirming that declaration from 1865. Petition that our religious convictions be recognized by those in authority, and that we be required to serve our country only in such capacity as will not violate our conscientious obedience to the law of God. And yet, even though there was provision in the law for conscientious objectors who were members of churches historically opposed to violence, we saw Adventists, Mennonites, Hutterites, Jehovah's Witnesses, and members of many other groups opposed to the war who were imprisoned. Some went to Alcatraz, Leavenworth. 2 Hutterites died as martyrs. Dartmoor prison in the UK had 17 Adventists, and the British Adventists have a video about that you can find on YouTube. And that political peace movement collapsed, and Émile Arnaud joined the military and fought. C.S. Longacre, who was the religious liberty director, said, those were times when the very existence of our work was threatened by those who were in military authority concerning misunderstandings and false reports sent to government authorities. The Federal Department of Justice received over 10,000 complaints against us, our published literature, and our work during the first 6 months of war. And this is something that Kevin Burton has really dug into, getting into the relatively recently opened archives of what was then called the Bureau of Investigation to see just how thorough they were. 100 Adventists in the military were court-martialed. 30 were sentenced to hard labor at Fort Leavenworth with sentences up to 10 to 50 years. And we know their names, not because the conference paid any attention or the local church, but because the Mennonite minister kept a record of everybody who was in there for conscientious objection reasons. They had brutal physical punishment, torture. The church finally appealed to Senator Warren Harding, who had Adventist connections, and he alleviated their sentences, and there was pardons at the end of the war. Kevin has done amazing work on how much the investigation went with government agents infiltrating the church, questioning the publications, demanding editing and censorship of Adventist publications, including books by A.G. Daniels and Carlyle B. Haynes, and even the Bible readings for the home, softening what was said about Revelation 13. And Jehovah's Witness leaders went to prison, as did many others. The Holiness and Pentecostal churches, they, at their founding around 1900, were all unanimously anti-war. But through pressures after World War I, World War II, they slowly came on board, and the Assemblies of God was the last church to change its anti-war position, and that was only in the Vietnam era. 1919 Bible Conference. If you get into those things, they talked about a lot more than Ellen White, the manager of the review, talked about how he was investigated and how he went ahead and they edited Bible readings for the home. And they thought for sure people were going to notice that and object to it, but nobody noticed it. So they breathed a sigh of relief. In Germany, of course, we know the story of how this super-nationalism went there. Ludwig Conradi, who, interestingly, when he was an evangelist in the upper Midwest, he and his brother converted a whole Mennonite town to Adventism. And at one point they joked, it's a good thing they don't know about our rifles that we have at home for hunting. They might have something to say to us. And today there's a lot of Mennonite names in Adventist circles because of that effort, like Tom Taves at Union, Vote. Even the Seibolds have some Mennonite connections, I'm told, by Lauren. But this is probably familiar. I'll go quickly. They just basically said, Conradi said, forget about the Sabbath, forget about non-combatants, bear arms to fight for the fatherland. And here, April of 1918, they said, hey, at the beginning of the war, our organization was split into two parties. 98% of our membership searched the Bible and came to the conviction that they need to defend the country with weapons on the Sabbath. Unanimously endorsed by the leadership, announced to the war ministry, 2% wouldn't agree. It had to be disfellowshipped because of their unchristian conduct, because they didn't want to kill and they didn't want to fight on the Sabbath. These unprofitable elements set themselves up as preachers and with little results sought to make converts to their propaganda of foolish ideas. They call themselves falsely preachers and Adventists. They are not. They are deceivers. When such elements receive their merited punishment, we regard it, in fact, as a favor done to us. And that was the origin of the German Reformed Seventh-day Adventist Church. Between the wars, you had the Conference of Pacifist Churches that became the Conference of Historic Peace Churches. That's when we first see that term arise. And that included the Mennonites, the Quakers, and the Church of the Brethren. And they said, we stand together and we're going to work together to make sure that we have our rights. Oh. And the church in Canada, a suspicious user named Zoom is requesting remote control of your computer. Is that you, Lauren? Nope. And they said, we have the same faith as the Quakers, they said in 1933 in Canada. Of course, then in the United States comes the emphasis upon conscientious cooperators. The Medical Cadet Corps is founded. Hey, let's prepare for the next war by working with the National Guard, starting in Nebraska, to get our youth trained as medics. Fort Worth Telegram reporter said, hey, these are not conscientious objectors, they're conscientious cooperators. And Carlyle B. Haynes took that phrase and ran with it. And of course, Desmond Doss used it. Now, Haynes was one who, he was investigated for we've got somebody who is trying to hijack this. It said, a user with the title, William Cork likes kids, wants to control your computer. So, Lauren, I don't know who got into the group that is not of the group.
Yeah, sorry about that. I will try to hold on to they have left now, but we've had a little bit of trouble with this recently. Sorry about that. Just keep going.
Okay. So Carlyle Haynes, again, his book, The Return of Jesus, had been censored and he was investigated. They were accusing him of being violating the Espionage Act. So he fought that, but his response was to become a super patriot. And he became the first secretary of the War Service Commission, both in World War I and World War II. And his job was really to emphasize, hey, we're not conscientious objectors. We're not pacifists. We're not like these other people. We're supporting the America. We're supporting the government. All we want to do is to have our individual rights respected. Otherwise, we'll do whatever we want in the military, short of killing. Yeah, they're in the middle of that first one. We're not conscientious objectors, meaning we don't oppose war. We don't agitate against war. We don't organize against war. We make no protest against war. We're not unwilling to serve in the military organization when drafted. We're not opposed to saluting the flag. We're not opposed to wearing our country's uniform. We're having to take a well-defined separation between ourselves and war resistors, pacifists, conscientious objectors to war, and all others who refuse service to the country. We've designated our position non-combatants, and that's it. Very few Adventists took advantage of civilian public service, and he scorned them for doing so and said, you're doing more than us. God be with you if you take that position. There were articles in the paper about his position. He made his position very clear. But there's also articles at the time where he was going around at camp meeting defending segregation and saying God's plan is to separate the races and keep them away from one another. So I don't see Carlyle B. Haynes as the good guy here. And what he's doing really, and I'm going to go very fast for the next slides.
Where is he?
He's the GC director for War Service Commission and a great evangelist of the 20th century. God Sent a Man, his book is still sold about Moses. So he's doing this super American patriotism in the US. And the church in Germany is taking the same approach in the German context. We're good Germans. We'll do what the German fatherland says. If they want us to bear arms, we will. They start praising Hitler for his vegetarianism and non-smoking. And German leaders saying, members of our denomination stand loyally by the Fuhrer in the Reich. They are continually encouraged and supported in their basic attitude. The leadership of the denomination considers this as one of its most noble duties. That was Adolf Mink, who was one of the Conference or Union presidents. And even after the war, they never admitted they made any mistakes. And after World War I and World War II, the General Conference never imposed any sort of church discipline on any of the German leadership. Of course, Cold War, I could do another presentation on another day. That's a big thing in itself. 1954 is when our current statement was really developed. Adventists take a non-combatant position in their accepting of citizenship as well as its benefits. They will serve the state in any non-capacity. 1970, that statement was 72 is tweaked. Adventists don't take a non-combatant position, they advocate it. And then it added this same caveat at the bottom that was in 1934. It's not a rigid position binding church members, but gives guidance, leaving the individual member to assess the situation for himself. Here, those who wanted to be pacifists, 1-0, were told by the military, well, you can't take that position because your church's official position is 1-AO, non-combatant. So the GC put that in to allow Adventists who called themselves pacifists to be covered and protected. There was a conference in 2019 at the GC that Elder Wilson called that basically reaffirmed the church's official position. But the church has really been quiet. Not since the 70s has the church been very forceful about teaching the position. Now, there's this book that Frank Hazel and Barna Magarashi put out, and they took a very strong anti-military position, especially based on German history. But But that what I've heard among American Adventists is, hey, the church teaches it's really your choice. We don't care either way, whether you're a combatant or a non-combatant. Others said, the church has always had diverse attitudes. German history shows we can take a pragmatic approach. Oh, they quibble about the distinction between thou shalt murder and thou shalt not kill. But here's a good book by Woma Bailey on that topic that says, no, that argument is not as cut and dried as some people make it. But especially the people that oppose it seem to me to really flatten the Bible, treat the whole Bible as just this blank slate that you can pick and choose, mix and match whatever you want. So they'll say, well, Jesus said this, but hey, we've got all these examples of warriors in the Old Testament. God told them to kill, so we can ignore what Jesus said in favor of what the Old Testament says. Your choice, it doesn't matter. What if Adventism took that approach to the Sabbath, to diet, or to your topic of last week, sexuality? What if the official GC position was, hey, do what you want on these matters? They say, hey, it won't work in some countries. Well, that's led the Adventist Church to take very pragmatic positions, not only in Germany, but also to work with the Soviet Union and other communist countries. And we had split off groups in many of these countries that were not recognized by the General Conference, those who wanted to maintain their position. So essentially, for many people, it's like the only issue to stand on is the Sabbath. If Sunday laws are instituted, then we'll be worried, but give in on everything else. And that's why a lot of white middle-class Adventists defend their support of Donald Trump and Christian nationalism. Well, they're not talking about the Sabbath. Well, as we saw this week, the Heritage Foundation is saying Sunday laws, without exception, are part of their program. And there's been times when the church has used nationalism to get privilege. And that's what we called Babylon back in the day. The woman, faithless, riding on the beast. And we can look around the world and there's all kinds of examples of this approval of nationalism and tribalism. Rwanda, friends of mine were missionaries there, and they were told by the mission president, don't say anything about love of others or Jesus breaking down walls, and that we should be all together regardless of which tribe we are. Well, he and his son were tried and convicted of war crimes afterwards. Broader position, Neil Wilson, speaking in Moscow in 1987 with Gorbachev in front of him, said that we Christians have to have a commitment to social justice that is intrinsic to peace. And we have this GC call for peace in 2002 that says we need to be about advocating for social justice and peace. The two go together. We need to stand and improve human rights and injustices economically and otherwise. We have to be peacemakers, not just saying we can't do this ourselves, but we have to be involved in the world through our hospitals, through our educational institutions, through our ADRA, doing things that make for justice and peace. And they said each of our schools, this is 2002, every one of our schools, colleges, and universities should set aside 1 week each school year to emphasize and highlight peace. Different programs, cultural awareness, nonviolence, peacemaking, conflict resolution, as a way of making a specifically Adventist contribution to a culture of social harmony and peace. The church's education department is preparing curricula to implement this peace program. I asked Lisa Beardsley Hardy a few years ago, did that ever happen? She said, nope, that was dropped very quick. And she wasn't involved in that. They said pastors should be preaching regularly to proclaim the gospel of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation, which dissolves barriers created by race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and religion, and promotes peaceful human relations between individuals, groups, and nations. What if that had happened? What if the schools and the churches and the pastors had really taken up that banner? What would we be like today? Okay, I went fast, but here we are. We got some time for talk.
Jerry?
Yes, sir. George, you are up first. You've got a question on your mind or a comment. Please, let's extend this.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting, very rich, and very appropriate for the times that we are living now. It's a brief question, not question, a brief comment that, in my opinion, at least for me, we are way too dependent on a religious institution in terms of allowing that institution to determine what we should do, what we should think, and all that stuff. This is the Adventist way to be. I was raised like that, and it took me a while to abandon this dependency on the church to tell me what should I think, what should I do. In cases of politics, like especially now that you are living now, very dangerous times, I think that everyone has to make their own mind, independently of what the church or someone up there thinks. You know, someone at the GC published this. You know what? I don't care, because there is no consistency. Look what happened in Germany, as you brought it up. And so it's a very vulnerable terrain to be dependent on a church position on anything. We have to determine by ourselves what is right, what is humane, what is good, and we have to abide by that. In our days now, this position will be very important, because we are getting into very dark days, and we haven't seen nothing yet here in America. So that's my point to present. Maybe I have a question later this time. Thank you for the presentation.
William, what response do you have, William?
Oh, thank you, George. That is just wonderful. And of course, within Adventism, there is the Adventist Peace Fellowship, which is individuals and professors and others that have been trying to advocate for peace, but I don't think their voice is still very strong. Chris Blake was my parents attended the Hagerstown Church, and Chris was their Sabbath school teacher. I showed up at Union one time to give a talk about such things, and had lunch with him, and he gave me the 10th degree in terms of questioning where I was and what I stood, but we ended up as good friends in the midst of it. But yeah, you're right. Thomas Merton once said, "Now is the time for every man to stand on his own 2 feet." And that's what I hear you saying.
Good. Thank you, both of you, for reiterating that stance. Shanique, what's on your mind?
Hi there. Hi there. A pleasant afternoon to everyone on this platform today. Thank you very much for Mr. Cork, William Cork, for your presentation. This was actually my first time actually logging in, and I'm really happy that I did. So I'll just move very quickly with a question just to make sure that I'm not taking up too much time. But my question is, and I'm a peacemaker, but I found that being a peacemaker can be very easily calculated, not just as a peacemaker, but a peacemaker and a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. A lot of persons can tend to miscalculate my, how can I say, my stance on diverse situations, diverse personalities, inclusions, things of that nature, and very easily can be mistaken for a sense of weakness. And therefore, I can very easily say that because of it, I have experienced some form or another of persecution. And so my question is, because I have aggressively tried to deal with it in terms of research, in terms of study, and not just any research, but Bible research. And so being able to collaborate in this forum today really provides, I mean, this is really the work of the Holy Spirit, because now I need to know what steps can I now take to not just enforce acts of peace in my community, in my workplace, in my church, not just for me, but for those around me. Because then I think about discipleship and I think about not imposing my belief on others, but then I also want to be able to get the message across, as, get God's message across. I've shared the great controversy with my immediate supervisor, and she completely ignored it. And when I say she completely ignored it, it's almost as though she just continued, just it well it just it, to me it just did not help. And 3 years later, since she came into the work environment, she's just now, just yesterday, uh, opened up to approach or address professionalism a little differently. So, about peace, it's all about peace, discipleship, and how do I share it with others without getting hurt?
Good, a very practical approach. Thank you, Shanique, and appropriate to today. William?
Yeah, well, it starts in our attitudes towards one another, starting with, what do we do when that person cuts us off in traffic? Something that happens often to me. In our conversations with our kids. Yeah, I wrote something for Spectrum some years ago, and it's online, about teaching our kids. How do we recover that sense of teaching one another and learning about peace? That was part of a talk that I gave at Andrews for the youth symposium, a number of years ago, probably almost 10 years ago now. And then I attended there's an Institute for Faculty and Peace Studies that the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies at Notre Dame has. Wonderful resource for lots of things about making a difference. And they talk about peace building, bringing together these different things that contribute to peace. But somebody put that the Presbyterian Church USA, the Mennonites, a lot of denominations do publish a lot of materials for how do I live that peace out in my daily life? How do I live that peace in my own heart? So maybe I can post some things on the Adventist Today webpage to link towards that. That'll have to be my short answer.
Okay, thanks. Lauren?
Yeah. First of all, I want to just apologize to you. We've had a few invaders here, and that's kind of inevitable. And I apologize for people saying nasty things. I deputized a couple of helpers who are keeping an eye on things, so that helps. I'm wondering, I grew up with that notion that we should be non-combatants. And the more I've looked at that word, Bill, the more uncomfortable I've become with it. I've heard various ways of expressing this, and non-combatancy is the one that Adventists generally use. There's pacifism. Adventists aren't pacifists. There's another word that I've heard, pacificism. I think I've said that right. That sort of partakes of the notion that that we should participate in just wars. Somehow, I don't want to fight, but if we have to, we do. Something along those lines, and I'm not conversant on all the details. But a few years ago, your colleague Gary Council wrote a book that, and I kept wondering why he would do this. He wrote a little booklet that got distributed rather widely. It identified him as the head of chaplaincy, and basically said, in very moderated ways, but it came through. You probably remember this little booklet. I've got it laying around somewhere, and I didn't think to look at it for it today. In rather moderate ways, but basically said, no, we can't stand for that. People have to be able to defend their country, and we should support them in defending their country. I had a little bit of an exchange with Gary at that time. Not much, just a little back and forth. He said, "Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying." It bothered me. It bothered me not so much that he thought that, but that he was willing to print the book and say it as though it were, even though he said he didn't publish it under the auspices of his office, that he was willing to say it in a way that it sounded like he was publishing it under the auspice of his office. Do you know anything about that shift in tone, or whether it had any consequences? Why Elder Council took it upon himself to do that? Was it the right thing to do? Yeah, I think there certainly were some Seventh Adventists who thought so. I didn't. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. And as I say, Gary was the one who invited me into the position and remained a friend, though we have some very strong disagreements, especially recently, on such things. But there was that shift. So Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries grew out of the War Service Commission in the 80s. You know, as more chaplains were in the military, there were like 6 Adventist chaplains in Vietnam, and then in the 80s it started to grow, and they created this organization to unite the former National Service Organization and the War Service Commission, and hospital chaplains and police chaplains and campus chaplains, all in one big organization.
Right.
And they'd always had a civilian as head of it. Marty Feldbush was the last one, but then Dick Stenbacher was the first Army veteran to lead the position, and he retired as a colonel and had been at the Pentagon for part of his ministry, as did Gary. Gary was the logistics guy for the Chief of Chaplain's office during the first Gulf War. And so here we have directors who come from that military background where they've thrived in it and loved it. And I think that has caused them to take that shift. Some people in the military come out more strongly against war, and others come to think, oh, this isn't so bad after all. Come on in, the water's fine. And so I think that's how that shift came, by having directors of chaplaincy who had long careers as senior military leaders.
Was there any pushback from other people
I haven't
in
heard
that
it.
building?
No.
I don't think I didn't hear it either.
No,
it surprised me a little bit.
There was pushback from individuals. I mean, Stefan Zieg and Barna Magdarashi and I have had lots of conversations when I was in Europe for something. And on the other hand is Cliff Goldstein, who had an article in the Review just totally rejecting pacifism a few years ago. But I think the church as a whole has forgotten. The story hasn't been told. Mel Gibson lifts up Desmond Doss as a hero, but people think, oh, he was just one example. Not actually the hundreds and hundreds of Adventists and other non-combatants that were serving in that role. So I think society had changed. The dominance of America in the church has made a difference in contemporary life. Consider who was the GC president when that 2002 peace statement came out, as opposed to later. I think Paulson was much more attuned to these things than Ted.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of factors going on. Yeah.
Yeah. No, Personally, I still would like to maintain. I know that non-combatancy is a little bit of a weak position. It has been criticized for that, but it's better than nothing, Bill.
Oh, and let me
You know,
say too that when Haynes talked about it, he didn't just mean being a medic. Oh, you could be a truck driver. You could bring logistics. You could carry the bombs. You could do anything where you're not actually up front, infantry or tanks shooting the enemy. Was basically his version of non being a non-combatant.
that's really interesting. And by the
Yeah,
way, there's some pretty good evidence showing that Carlyle B. Haynes had a lot of correspondence with people who were anti-Semites and racists,
yeah.
and
Well,
was
yeah, his
very
own
much
statements were so
liked by them.
yeah. Well, his statements were so clear, and I was reading Calvin Rock's history, and that's where I found this statement that Haynes gave defending segregation outside of Atlanta. And that's when I started looking for other sources, found him speaking at the Lincoln Camp meeting, same words. And so I went to the uh, Adventist History Center at Andrews, and I found the sermon that he was his stump speech in those days, and
Interesting.
it all fits in with the tenor of the age: anti-communism, anti-UN, rejecting this idea of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man as tending towards communism. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover could have written this speech, and how
Wow.
God, the Tower of Babel, divided humanity, and it's God's will for the races to be separated. And of course, that's when the GC cafeteria was segregated, and Lucy Byers died. So he was not an outlier in General Conference attitudes in the 40s.
Wow. Wow. Oh, man, that's amazing. Maybe next time you talk to us, you could do us a class on Carlyle B. Haynes. Carmen, my wife, was the first one to dig that out, and she said she had read some segregationist who said one of his big heroes, somebody he admired, was Carlyle B. Haynes, a Seventh-day Adventist, who has really held the line against the black people and the Jews. I was like, whoa, I did not know that. Hey, thanks a lot. This
Let's
is
go for some
really
of these
good.
other people.
Yeah.
Art, you have made your position on war and pacifism known for a half a century. Where do you stand today as a historian and participant in this argument?
Well, at first I want to apologize to all the people who are regulars here because I've told this story too many times. Bill's not heard it though, so I'm going to tell it again. And that is, I turned 18 years of age in January of 1970. And of course, Vietnam was still moving along at a pretty good pace at that time. There was hope on the horizon, but it was still people were subject to the military draft. And of course, the stance of the Adventist Church at that time was that you should ask for a 1AO status, which says I'll be one of these conscientious cooperators, and I'll serve in the military. I just won't carry a gun. And typically, that meant to be a medic or be this is a pejorative term. I don't necessarily mean it in a pejorative way. It'd be a guinea pig for biological and agents, basically be injected with dangerous substances to see how you'd react to it. So when I turned 18, you had to register for the draft, and when you registered for the draft, you told them which classification you wanted. The one that everybody could get is 1A, which means you would just serve as a regular military member. 1AO says that you wanted to be that you wouldn't carry a weapon basically, but you'd serve. And there was a third classification other than 4F, which says you couldn't serve because of physical problems. The other classification was 1O, which is a conscientious objector. As I said, the Adventist position typically was they wanted their people to serve and be medics or not carry weapons. I at the time, of course, some of this had to be affected by how frightening the Vietnam War was, but I had done a lot of reading and studied a lot and decided that that an Adventist person or a religious person, a follower of Christ, should be a non-combatant. It's refused to serve at all in the military and refused to aid in the war effort. I applied for that and the only way I was going to get it was if I had an interview with the draft board. And I did go through an interview with the draft board, and you needed to be able to tell them that you were willing to go to prison rather than serve. At any rate, before I had my interview with the draft board, I got called in by the principal of my academy and the vice principal, and they took me to task for applying as a conscience objector. And I was told by them that I was bringing shame upon the church for making such an application. At any rate, I did have my interview with the draft board, and I got my classification. It wasn't until some years later that I happened to see a copy of my file, and I learned that the vote was 2-1 in favor of granting me the application. And I also saw in the file that the academy pastor had written a letter to the draft board and told them that I should not be given that status, that the only reason I was doing it was to try to be popular. So just that jumping ahead to just a couple of other points. I won't belabor that. But as everyone here knows, there have been some occurrences, some instances where there have been clashes between government agents and protesters recently, in Minneapolis in particular. And we all know about Renee Good and her death at the hands of an ICE agent. And I've heard some comments, which I think are really quite appropriate, saying, what you believe is what you see. There are people out there who believe that she deserved what she had coming. She was trying to run the agent over, and there are people who feel otherwise. I won't get into what I feel, but what you believe tends to be what you see, and it colors everything. When you look through your own set of glasses, everybody has their own set of glasses they look through, and it changes everything. There was one other point I wanted to make, and something that I'm really troubled by the idea of a just war. And I know there's a lot of people a lot smarter than I have who have opined on that. But what I see, and every time we get involved in a military action someplace around the world, the propaganda machine comes out. And comparisons, it's inevitable that, and I recall very clearly, Saddam Hussein, for instance, was compared to Hitler. And that's when you know we're about to go to war, is when the disfavored country is compared to Hitler or godless, something like that. So at any rate, I worry about that, about how we really can tell whether or not a war is just. Maybe sometimes it is clear, but we are so permeated. Our society is so permeated with propaganda. One last thing I want to say: there are changing standards too. We've all heard the comment or the phrase that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, and that's sort of this universal thing that there's some things you just can't say because it could cause panic or is just beyond the pale and people could get damaged. What isn't well known is that that phrase comes from the decision in the case of Shank versus or United States versus Shank or Shank versus United States. I don't remember which the title is, but Charles Shank was a I think a socialist who was passing out flyers. He and several other people were passing out flyers to draft age men, urging them not to cooperate with the draft. That was what you couldn't shout fire in a crowded theater about. Today, that wouldn't get anywhere. I mean, hopefully, even with the changes of the Supreme Court, I don't think that decision would stand up. But at any rate, that's just a comment about propaganda and my concerns about a just war. Thanks.
William,
Thanks,
how do you respond? That's
there is so much. I love it. Thanks for sharing your story. Yeah, just war is an issue that a lot of people are debating today. Can there be just war when you have atomic bombs. Even a chief of chaplains resigned over that in the Reagan period. The two-star chief of chaplains tried to counter Reagan's Vietnam and Central American policy, and he was quickly told his advice was not wanted. But there's a guy, Robert Marr, Meagher. Yes, that's spelled Marr, pronounced Marr, Irish name. Wrote a book on moral injury, saying that this just the existence of moral injury and people having these what are now recognized in a DSM diagnosis subgroup as being a real genuine condition, religious conflict, moral conflict, that there's plenty of things about that call into question the whole structure of just war theory when we look at what the impact of all wars is and the impact of propaganda and so on, and that betrayal of trust that comes with it. So all kinds of things that we could say. I did have a mention in my presentation that I skipped over. There were just a handful of Adventists who did apply for that 1O status and were applied to civilian worker camps. But Sabrina Riley, who does the research in that area, she only found out about it because of the archives of the Mennonite Central Committee, that there were half a dozen or a dozen Adventists who were kind of looked down upon for doing that and not becoming medics. So there's lots of stories, and I saw a number of them in the chat too that I wish we could go into.
Yeah.
Phil, just one other comment before I
Yeah.
before I turn off my audio. It does seem that when you're analyzing what is a just war, how much oil the other country has seems to play a part.
Yeah. Well, historically, presidents and politicians have only used just war principles to justify themselves and their war. They've never used it to say, oh, maybe we can't do that.
Yeah. Good observations, both. Brian Ness, you're a respected mind. Share a bit of it with us.
Well, I hope. Anyway, I thanks, Art, because mine kind of falls on yours a little bit. I did not turn 18 till a little later than you, about 1979. So when I turned 18, so the draft was over. But I remember growing up my younger years and hearing about it, and I knew of people that had to sign up. And I do recall at that time the church, at least it seemed like that what I was hearing in my community was that you could either apply for one of those two categories, either non-combatant or conscientious objector, and either was fine. But it was much better to do the non-combatant one. And like Desmond Doss. And I remember the story of Desmond Doss a lot in those days. We had the book from, I think, Pacific Press or Review and Herald that was very popular. I think The Unlikeliest Hero, if I remember the title correctly. And, so I remember all that. And, but I didn't have to worry because I would have been 1F. So, or because I had birth defects that would have kept me out. So I never had to worry about it. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the more recent stuff too, because I have been very active for the last several years in a variety of sort of nonviolent protests, a lot of going out on protests and marching down the street, that sort of thing. And sometimes those will occur on Sabbath, and I will go because I think, to me, that Jesus' example is that justice work, and I see that as justice work, should happen whenever it needs to happen. And he did a lot of work towards justice on Sabbath, so I don't feel that there's any problem with doing that. But I've gotten criticism for that, saying, "You're doing that on Sabbath? I mean, how can you do that? Why would you even do something like that?" And then, it's also felt like the church has gradually shifted over time and has not been as forthright about these kinds of protests, isn't really supportive of that as much as maybe they might have for a little while. It seemed like we were heading that way, and then it went away. And I think the current administration that we have in Washington has, I think, influenced some of that. It feels like the church is sort of trying to please the current administration and not make waves or something. And so it's been a little bit of an uncomfortable position, but and lastly, I just want to thank you for the history, because I always felt the church was I felt the church was historically more or less pacifist. I wouldn't say completely so, because certainly lots of things the church has said over the years also supports what Art was talking about, just war, whatever that might be. And I think the church sometimes felt like there was something like that that could be decided. But it just feels like it's much more difficult for me as a member of the Adventist community to feel like they have my back, that my fellow members have my back on this, and that they really also are supportive of some of these social justice issues. And I found that for me, my biggest inspiration has been not from any Adventist writers on this, but I think some of you may have heard of Walter Wink, and he was. He did some very wonderful work about from the Sermon on the Mount, for example, about the very quote that you gave earlier about turning the other cheek, and how that really fits in. That's not lack of resistance. That's nonviolent resistance. It is resistance to turn the other cheek, because when you turn the other cheek, you're actually forcing that person to recognize you as an equal in this struggle, and then you're also pointing out the injustice of the system. So anyway, that's just kind of rambling thoughts there, but I do appreciate greatly the history part of that. But I'm really concerned about the current nonviolent resistance movement, and I'm concerned about Minneapolis, that there may be some who, and I hear this from friends occasionally, that, oh, we need to bring violence in. The only way to cure this is to be violent. We have to fight against ICE, and I think that would be such a bad move. So anyway, that's all I have to say, and any response back is great. So,
Yeah,
William?
there's definitely some difference in approach between NAD and General Conference. So that after the George Floyd's death, there was a march that went from the Lincoln Memorial to the Martin Luther King Memorial, I believe is the direction that it went. And Dan Jackson and Alex Bryant were participating in that. And it was specifically to add an Adventist voice to that. And there were Adventists in a number of places, some college campuses and so on. So that's the one time recently where I saw it, and I saw it with the senior NAD leadership participating in it.
and that's good.
Here's where, let me just say, here's where we see another fault line within Adventism between the white middle class Midwestern churches and the African American churches. I mean, the most prominent Adventist here in Houston was Sheila Jackson Lee, who was a member of the Fondren Church. I saw her in church there many times when I go, or the Who. And her Adventism was always front and center in her advocacy for justice. And she showed up for things, and she kept getting elected, and everybody knew she loved the camera a bit much, but everybody knew she was doing real good work for the community, and her views were typical of Black Adventists, not necessarily Caribbean or Nigerian Adventists, but African American Adventists. The best pastors conference I've been to is PELC, the pastors conference every December at Oakwood, where you hear some great social justice preaching and advocacy and leadership. So for me, that's where more of this is going to come from. Now, there are still individual regional conference presidents who want people just to make as many baptisms as possible. But there are many too that are out there saying, no, here's where the church needs to have a voice and where the Black church needs a voice.
Yeah. Well, and I do appreciate the fact that the Adventist Church has had a history of advocacy for justice. And so it's not that we haven't had it. It's just I feel, as you say, there's a rift. And I think there are some people that feel like we're being fanatical if we get too much into that.
Yeah.
Brian, before you go, can you tell us what you'll be talking with us about next week?
Oh, okay. I give a quick plug, I guess. It'll be about basically the discovery of dinosaurs, which until recently I hadn't thought about this, but the discovery of dinosaurs happened about the same time our church was forming. Dinosaurs were not really recognized as such until the 1820s and 30s. So by 1844, I mean, this was kind of the big hot topic in natural history. So, and then of course our church developed our various views about Genesis, and it clashes a bit with the dinosaur stuff. So I'll be talking about how those discoveries impacted the larger Christian world in terms of how they view Earth history and the flood and things like that, and then how the Adventist Church responded. So, anyway, that's a quick one on it.
Sounds good. Thank
Good.
you.
Look forward to that. Andreas, I welcome your thoughts as a person in the EU and with German background in particular. What are your observations on what William has been presenting here?
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me because I'm working with a
can very
different
well.
technology.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Two disclaimers. One you already mentioned, I'm German. The second one is I've worked in the VA veterans system for a couple of years in the trauma recovery services. So first of all, thank you for the wonderful historical insights that have been given to us. Even without those insights, I just would like to state very clearly, and this is my bias, that if I hadn't been leaning towards pacifism before, once you have worked in the VA system, worked with traumatized veterans, you will become more peace-oriented. And you will learn a lot about propaganda and how propaganda destroys people and is the first thing to go in any war. So I'm very European, very German when it comes to that, and I want to say a couple of things about that. But I would also like to show the other side. As a German, I live a couple of 100 miles away from the Ukrainian border. And it has become more and more difficult to argue for something like a pacifist position. And of course, Germans always are grateful to the American troops who have liberated Germany after the Nazi times. So it is a difficult topic. That's what I'm saying. However, I just wanted to add a little bit of a German perspective, and that is conscientious objectors. That was the rule for both West German and East German people since World War II. And there's very little understanding about the growth of military involvement of Adventists, especially in the US, here in Europe, and especially in Germany after World War II and after or during East German communist rule. In East Germany, people who objected were drafted to building projects that were called Bausoldaten, building soldiers, to build all kinds of facilities, sometimes military facilities, but generally civil ones. While in West Germany, conscientious objectors were doing a civil service in hospitals, old people's home, and so forth. It was rare, very, very rare, that Adventists would have gone to the military and would have been looked frowned upon. So that has to be said after you quoted Conradi so perfectly well, and Conradi was quite a guy in many respects. But it shows me, even the story and history of Conradi shows me that culture is probably more powerful than religion. And as a theologian, that's very, very hard to say. We're working so hard on our theology, but in the end, it's our surrounding, it's our culture that influences us. And indeed, at the moment in Germany, we find nationalistic parties rising like mad, and it's absolutely crazy. And our church leadership in Germany is quite appalled about this because it's even reaching our churches. So I just wanted to add that perspective because you looked into the history, and rightly so. Reform Adventists split off in those days, but there has been a lot of talk going on between the Adventist Church and Reformed Adventism in Germany, and but the separation has been finalized. So thanks to Conradi. But that's a different story, Conradi. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for that perspective. One of the things I loved about my NAD job was every couple of years I got to go to Germany to do a retreat for service members, or I took some Air Force chaplains on a tour of all the Luther sites one time. We went to Constance, been to Zurich, took them to the Anabaptist sites, went to Wewelsburg in the Northwest, which was kind of the model SS community. It had a castle that Himmler thought was the ideal Grail castle. And there was the Niederhagen concentration camp, which was predominantly conscientious objectors. There's nothing left of it now. There's a triangle in the pavement at the center of it, but it was primarily Bible students, Jehovah's Witnesses, and some Adventists that were there as well. And that just stood out for me that that's the only place that I've been to that really highlighted that story. And the museum there was interestingly founded by people more like my age who realized, wait, not a single person in our community was ever called to account for anything that they did. And so we want to be able to tell that story of our parents. I went to a Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary. My dean, Gerhard Krodel, he was a Luftwaffe pilot, flew a Stuka, and had some stories about different POW camps. My church history professor, Eric Gritsch, was Austrian. He was in the SS Hitler Youth and given a Luger and told he could kill any boy in his troop that disagreed with him or opposed him. And one of the first churches I pastored had a Holocaust survivor in it. So those were some of the formative experiences for me as a young chaplain, and then as a chaplain to get to know the German people today and some of the church leaders in both Germany and Switzerland. And I'm grateful for their witness. I'm grateful that they can point that finger to the American church and say, wait a second, we know this story. Let's tell you what we've learned and why we stand the way we do. So thanks for sharing, Andres.
Hey, Bill,
Howard.
let me throw in something here. We Adventists often, well, a lot of people sort of chuckle about Jehovah's Witnesses. And Adventists love to also at the same time talk about how we're going to be persecuted. Let's just recognize, everybody, Jehovah's Witnesses are probably the most persecuted religious minority in the entire world.
Yeah.
Thank you all. My beloved Linda Nottingham, what does your brilliant mind have to add to this opinionated conversation?
Oh, just bias and prejudice, Jerry, today.
Of course.
Good to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you, William, for your presentation. I think it was startling to me in some respects to realize the extent of our denomination's vacillation over the topic of combatancy and where to come down on it. It's surprising. And I think the thing I enjoyed most was the little tiny piece that you had, what it would be like if the church had the same laissez-faire attitude about the Sabbath and other things. So it's really sort of a puzzlement. But just to add an observation, I'm the child of parents who were very much involved in World War II. And my father was drafted into the Army immediately upon graduation from dental school. And while he did not serve abroad, he did serve on many Army bases and in Army hospitals around the country. And at one point, he was stationed in Chicago, and my mom was with him. They didn't have any children at that point in time. And a hotel, the Edgewater Beach Hotel, had been converted into a hospital. This is just a small piece of trivia in case people don't know this. And my mom said to him one day, because my father would go and dental care for men, servicemen who were there recuperating. And my mom thought she would go with him. She said, I'll go with you and I can visit with servicemen. And he wouldn't let her go because apparently that's where all the basket cases were. And I came to learn and understand that that's where the term basket case came from. It actually began in World War I, but it was a slang term for men who were quadruple amputees. And he felt it would just be too difficult for her to go and see so many men hanging in baskets from the ceiling.
Mm.
But having said that, I also have to say that, I find myself a bit questioning perhaps, because there is also the book that you have not mentioned, but I'm sure everyone is aware of, The Man in the High Castle, about a hypothetical scenario of what would have happened if World War II had turned out differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's easy to talk about combatancy versus non-combatancy in a sterile environment or in a situation that is purely hypothetical. But when you look at it in a real situation, does it cause one to look at it differently? And I suppose that's the thing you've sort of tossed around in your comments today.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you mentioned that book. I loved it, both, and the miniseries that was made of it. And I've been to the castle that was featured in the miniseries. The guy who becomes the Nazi leader, he at the time of the American defeat, he's stationed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which is where I did chaplain school, and my instructor was Temple Gregory Matthews III, who many of you know Gregory Matthews. That was interesting. But that's it. Yeah, that gets back to that point of, is the ideal the pacifist route where we expect this is how governments are all going to behave, or is it the two kingdoms route where we acknowledge a role for governments, but say as disciples of Jesus, we're called to a different path? And that's where there really hasn't been much theological discussion among Adventists. You see some other denominations that have written whole books on war and peace, or even volumes on baptism or the Lord's Supper. But, these are not things that Adventists have published books about. There were several books written by individual heroes of World War II. I got some years ago, Texas Conference called me up and said, "Hey, we've got somebody in the hospital at MD Anderson from out of town who's Adventist. Can you go visit?" Well, it was Eric Cry and his wife. She was having treatment. Eric's book was known to me as a young boy. It was Under the Blood Banner, about his time in the Hitler Youth. And he came to America and became a illustrator at Pacific Press and told this story. So I was able to have many, many, many long conversations with him, and what that was growing up, what his experience growing up was. And so that's where I come down into that two kingdoms approach, that there are things that governments have to do to protect their own and for justice, and there's things that Jesus has called us, I see, to a different way. Others are going to have a different approach, but that's kind of where I can fit into recognizing, yeah, something needed to be done. But could Jesus still in the midst of that call me to something else?
Linda, are you retort?
No, I guess, as they say, it's complicated, right?
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
complicated. It just depends on where you are, what the circumstances are at the time.
Thank you for that perspective. Ed Zerkwitz, sitting in front of your lake, where are you at there?
That's the ocean 2 blocks from where I live.
Lovely. How does that influence your thoughts today?
Well, two things. I've been thinking about this text that Jesus gave on the Sermon on the Mount. And by the way, thanks for your more revealing of the political background of the church. Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." So peacemaking is not merely being or avoiding conflict. It's getting involved in reconciliation of some sort, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first question I have is, or the main question I have is, has the Adventist Church used that statement when it comes to things like war and so forth? As part of what I just asked, when I think of the term non-combative, I may be slightly wrong here, but I get the impression it's anyone who doesn't actually get involved in harming or killing someone. And if I am accurate, then people from all kinds of backgrounds are non-combatives, without being against war per se. And non-combatant people are actually enabling the war. So anyways, I'll leave that with you if you want to comment on those things.
William?
Yeah, and that's Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries put out a video. This was under Gary's leadership about 20 years ago. It was after the Iraq War had been going for a while. And it had the voices of people who joined the military thinking, oh, we're non-combatants, doctors, nurses, dentists. And then we're shocked that they had to do weapons training. And then they told the stories of what their experience was like. And one, Joel Klimkowitz, talked about being a Marine who had a couple of deployments, and then he became an Adventist and wanted out as a conscientious objector, and he ended up going to prison. And it took his congressman and Dick Stenbakken and others to get him out, and he's now an Adventist pastor and an Army chaplain today. But that video, and it's there's hard copies of it around. There's a abbreviated version that's on YouTube that somebody put up. But it gets at that point, what is a non-combatant and how are we not all involved in this? Today, the Navy Chief of Chaplains, I heard him speak a couple of years ago, saying how, the chaplains are the ones who get people back into the fight. Well, that gives them a certain responsibility too, does it not? And I heard that you hear that kind of talk more in some services than in others. The Navy, Air Force, and Army have different ethoses, and this was specifically the Navy Chief of Chaplains who was talking more about how critical the chaplains are to maintain the fighting spirit. But yeah, that does blur the things when we all see we're all part of one machine and all listening to the same propaganda. I did a lot of peacemaking, being able to do conversations with imams of the Kuwait Ministry of Defense, took soldiers to the Grand Mosque of Kuwait, to the souk. Some friends of mine who were church members were living in Kuwait, and they took me to the souk al-Mubarakia, big marketplace. And they introduced me to a guy. They said, this guy loves talking religion. And he was a rug salesman. Every customer in that shop besides me was a oil executive from Houston. We were all Houstonians in this Kuwait shop. But I got to know the guy, and I would take soldiers there. And if he had no other customers, he'd take an hour to explain to my soldiers about how to buy a good Oriental rug. And how can you tell the rug made by the 17-year-old girl versus the one made by her 80-year-old grandmother, and different materials and so on. And they'd come out gushing, oh, that was wonderful. And I'd say to them, well, you just met your first Iranian Shia. What do you think? And outside of our camp, at Camp Beering, was a sign in Arabic and English saying, God bless U.S. troops. And and I took one to the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, in Qatar. And these soldiers would say, wait a second, what we're seeing is not what we're seeing on either CNN or Fox News. And on the one hand, we're there as part of a peace building mission to build relationships with the member states of the Gulf Cooperative Council. But on the other hand, what are we doing? We're supporting Saudi Arabia, which is probably the most extremist nation in the region, which has the most brutal record of religious liberty. So how are we not part of that, even in our peace building? So those were the kinds of conversations I got to have with soldiers on that muddy line of what is a combatant and what isn't.
A gray zone and a muddy zone, as you've described it. Angie, I haven't heard from you in a long time. How are you, dear?
I am doing just fine, and it's very
Wonderful.
nice to see you.
Yes.
And thank you. Yes, thank you for a great presentation. Here are my comments. So the folks that use "thou shalt not kill" today to ask for excuses, I'm a conscientious objection. The Bible says "thou shalt not kill." So there is a former Adventist pastor who is a theologian who I respect highly. And here is his take on the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, which I agree 100% with him. Thou shalt not kill was given to the nation of Israel, not an universal commandment, in my opinion. Thou shalt not kill who? So God said to the Israelites, thou shalt not kill. Who are you referring to? Who should I kill? Well, your fellow Israelites, because they killed plenty of the enemies. And there were exceptions to that rule, because if you broke the Sabbath, guess what happened to you? You got killed. So thou shalt not kill the fellow Israelites who are behaving, because if they don't behave, you kill them too. So to use thou shalt not kill as a Bible verse to say, I am not going to go to war, in my opinion, is a misuse of the commandment, which was not given to everybody, but to the nation of Israel. Now, the New Testament has additions, or if you want to call it derivatives of the Ten Commandments. Those are for sure applied to Christians, and those are for sure can be used for peacemaking and say, oh, I am not a violent person, etc., etc. In addition to that, if you look to the nation of Israel today, they are a heavily armed nation. I was in Israel in 2019. I was waiting for the bus in the bus station because I was going to cross to Jordan. And there were armed guards and police and personnel with machine guns patrolling the bus station in Israel, which made me feel nervous and at the same time kind of safe. But I don't think the Israeli youth can tell the Israeli government, oh, I am a conscientious objector and I'm not going to kill. They don't have that choice. The state of Israel is heavily armed to survive. I understand why they do it that way. They are carrying machine guns at the bus station. Now, if you go to a bus station here in the United States, you're not going to see soldiers with machine guns patrolling the bus station. Guarantee you that. That's not going to happen. So to say, thou shalt not kill, oh yeah, thou shalt not kill is there in the Bible, and I go by that commandment, and I'm not going to bear arms. Totally not acceptable to me. I think it's a misuse of the commandment, and I don't think that holds water. But that's my opinion. Just throwing it out there to see what is your opinion on that.
Okay, thanks.
William, what do you say?
Well, first on the Israeli situation, there is a big movement of conscientious objection to military service among young Israelis today, especially in wake of Gaza. And many have gone to prison for it and suffered for it. But that is moving because they see the injustice of what's happening. And it's ironic that American Christians are so much in favor of Israel leveling Gaza that they care not about the effect upon Palestinian Christians. And Israelis don't care if a Palestinian is Christian or Muslim. They've vandalized Christian churches. They've harassed Christian pastors. I got to spend a day with the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Michel Saba, who's the Catholic Archbishop there, and three of his leaders, his chancellor, his director of education, and another one. They were visiting Houston, and my brother worked for the patriarch at that time. So I've heard the Christian stories. Again, you can Google conscientious objectors in the Israeli army, and you'll come up with lots of stories of what's happening presently. But as you'll see from the Adventist article by George Amadon, thou shalt not kill was not the only thing. Of course, they pointed to the text, but especially they spoke to Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus overturns Moses lots of times. You have heard that it was said, and he quotes Moses, but I say to you, you heard it said, thou shalt not kill. I say, you shall love your neighbors. You shall not uh, damn them to hell. You're going to do over backwards. So that's where I raise my eyebrow at those Adventists who want to overturn Jesus by going back to Moses, because Jesus says, no, I get to interpret the law and I get to tell you what it means. And no, it's not just about not killing one group of people. It's about loving all, especially your enemies. And
Sure.
that's what stands out as the Christian ethic. That's what was seen by the Adventist leaders, the whole tenor of the New Testament, that Christ does not have an earthly kingdom, that we are to be builders of peace, that we are to put away the sword, and he heals the wounds of war. And even the tree of life is for the healing of the nations on into eternity. So that's where the Christian perspective, I think, has to start at. In many and various ways, Hebrews says, God spoke to our fathers of old by the prophets, but now in these last days he has spoken to us unto his Son. Ephapox is the Greek, once and for all, finally, completely fulfilling everything. So a Christocentric hermeneutic is going to take the words of Jesus above everything else in the New Testament or the Old Testament.
Thank you for that perspective, William. Let's hear it for Christianity in its truest sense, right?
We're kind of at the end of our time here. Linda Nottingham just raised her hand. Bill, would you take another question before we finish up?
Well, I was looking to see if my buddy Melvin Douglas was still on the call. I saw his face earlier and was waiting to see if Mel was going to say anything.
Melvin is still here. Melvin is still here.
Melvin, any thoughts?
I gave him a chance to unmute if he wants to. By the way, for all of those of you who are regulars here, I think something that would help in the future is if all of you used your real name, or at least let me know that you're not, if you have some particular reason. It really does help because I recognize most of the names, and then once in a while somebody will come on and they'll reuse somebody's name, and I quickly grab it and kick them out. And so we're working on the security thing. This is a common thing in Zoom meetings, but I love this meeting so much. I don't want it to be disrupted. Before we get
Melvin is
Linda,
unmuted. Can we let him come in?
yeah,
Since
Melvin
he
and
called out?
Linda. And before we do, though, let me just say again, next week, dinosaurs, people. We're going to be talking about dinosaurs. I love dinosaurs. And so really looking forward to dinosaurs. You just finish these last two questions, and then we'll say goodbye for the day and thank Bill for what he's done.
Melvin.
You have very good glasses spotting that I'm on and off of mute.
You're
Yes,
good.
Bill Cork is very popular in the Houston area and Galveston area, and very good choice. Lauren, well done. Whoever found this fella, that he even had time to come on today. I remember getting the paperwork on the Vietnam, and I was at South Lake Academy where you were, but different times. And I said, oh my, what do I do with this? And at that time, though, there was some system. It was like a blur to me, but they told me to go see the folks at the office, and somehow they got me out of. There was some little outlet, but I did not have to go any further with the paperwork. But it was a very memorable time because I had classmates who did get involved with the conflict. And of course, we never forget that, do we?
Yep.
And we all have friends and neighbors that and family members that were involved. And my number two brother, Jim, who died a couple of years ago, made 92 in Ohio. As they say, once a Marine, always a Marine, and to his very last day. He was a fellow that kept very active, and and kept all the good things that he did learn from staying active and conscientious during his time that he served in World War II. So thanks again, Lauren, for providing this spot, and whoever else was involved in. I'm glad he answered his phone. Bill Cork has a hard time answering his phone, so you usually have to text him first, and then he'll write back and say what he wants. So, thanks
I
again.
don't even know if you have my current phone number. I'll send it to you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
Linda.
let me,
Well done.
yeah,
I
let
just,
me just,
I just have
Mel-
something very, very short
Oh,
to
sure.
add
Yeah,
at the
go
end
ahead.
that I thought of in the wake of what Dr. Angie had to say. Some of you may recall that a couple or 3 years ago when Hamas horrifically killed 12 or 1,300, mostly young people in Israel who were at a music festival. And Tom Friedman, who is an economist who writes for the New York Times, who is a Jew, was asked what should Israel do in the wake of that. And what he said was, Israel should say, we forgive you.
Wow.
Imagine what would have been different, how many tens of thousands of people in Gaza would be alive today if they had been able to do that. Interesting thought.
And how many millions of people around the world would be alive if George Bush had said that after 9/11, if he would have
Indeed.
taken that as a criminal act and instead Brown University has a webpage with the statistics of how many service members, how many people died directly from combat, how many people died from starvation or medical issues because of hospitals. And it's in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, that were caused in revenge for 3,000 deaths.
Well, Janet Prouty posted it here. She said the first casualty of war is truth. And that's what happened at 9/11. There was not one Iraqi in the attacks on the Twin Towers, not one.
Lots of Saudis, though, but we got those out of the country fast. Yeah, I wanted to say something about Melvin. We met a number of years ago, and I see him each year at least at the Highland Games that he helps organize. But I met his brother Herb Douglas some years before that at the Questions on Doctrine 50th anniversary conference, and I came to love both these guys. But one of the things Melvin's got me into is one of the synagogues in town has a men's Seder before Passover, and they bring men together for a night of steak and fellowship and various beverages for those who drink. Melvin and I have our Diet Cokes, and it's a great way of bridge building, and that's what I like about our community. And Melvin's certainly a part of that, and I do things with our Holocaust Museum and with our Islamic Society, and for me, that's where it starts, both with the work I do healing veterans at the VA, working with our community to help diminish suicide, as well as working with our many different interfaith organizations. I've been involved with many of them for years. And when I got called by the Texas Conference in 2007, I told that to Leighton Holly, the president, and Doug Kilcher was the executive secretary. And I told him, I'm involved in a lot of things that typically you don't see Adventists in. And Leighton's advice was, whatever you're involved in, stay involved in. Whatever relationships you have in the community, keep up those relationships in the community. We need them. We need to be involved. And I'm grateful for Leighton's wisdom on that. So, Lauren, thank you.
Hey, thank you. This has been really good, and I really appreciate that insight. It's one of the reasons that what you're involved in, keep involved in. One of the reasons that, in spite of some of my questions, I keep involved in the Seventh Adventist Church. It's something that I have already invested in, and I think it's worth investing in some more. And I think a lot of people are here for that reason. This was a lovely class. Let's put you on the list again and get you scheduled again. Maybe we can do a little bit more of something. There were just so many places where you could have taken another road, and I wanted to learn more, Bill.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the white coats is one that's a passion of mine. Frank DeMazzo, who's over 100 now, is one of my good friends. And I had the job for NAD of being the liaison with the veterans that were part of that. So that would be a passionate thing that I'd like to talk about sometime.
okay, good. Hey, bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for staying.